The darkest secrets of the global elite have come to light, plunging 2 billionaires into a ruthless war. But when an African leader comes forward with the truth, the whole world stops to listen. This is a story of power, secrecy, and the unexpected rise of real resistance. Before we dive deep into this real drama that is unfolding before our eyes, involving names that everyone knows and secrets that few imagined, we kindly ask that you strengthen this space of information and analysis by subscribing to our channel right now so that you don't miss any detail of this and other transformative narratives that shape the future of our planet. Your subscription is the key to unraveling together the most complex layers of the global scenario and understanding the forces that really move the board, ensuring that you are always ahead in understanding the events that define our era. The world, in its constant and frenetic rotation, was abruptly paralyzed by a headline that, in its audacity and implications, resounded like thunder in a clear sky, coming directly from the digital platforms that shape public opinion and news, reporting that former President Donald Trump, with the characteristic ferocity that defines him on the global political scene, launched a devastating accusation that echoed through the corridors of power and social networks at dizzying speed, pointing the finger directly at Elon Musk, another monumental and indisputable figure on the world stage, suggesting that he would be using the infamous and disturbing files of Jeffrey Epstein as an insidious weapon to sabotage his already complex and ambitious campaign to return to the presidency of the United States, a position that he clearly aims to regain with an intensity that few seem to fully understand. That initial spark, thrown into the public domain, was not just a trivial exchange of barbs between billionaires, but rather the trigger for a conflagration that promised to further inflame a political environment already saturated with tensions and mistrust, raising the level of confrontation to unexpected and dangerous levels, exposing deep fissures in the power structure that many considered impenetrable. Elon Musk's response, as was to be expected from someone with his disruptive personality and propensity for direct confrontation, was not long in coming and was filled with an equally palpable and intense fury, countering Trump's accusations with sharp and blunt rhetoric, openly declaring that if the truth was really what they were seeking, the sealed files of the Epstein case, those dark repositories of secrets and unspeakable connections, would reveal that Trump's own name appeared there more times than that of any other prominent billionaire, thus casting an even greater shadow over the former president's past and associations, transforming the defense into a frontal attack that struck at the heart of his moral credibility and political legitimacy. Because Musk did not limit himself to denying the use of the files, he counterattacked with a statement that questioned the very basis of Trump's candidacy, arguing vehemently that the United States, at such a critical moment in its history and faced with the challenges that await it, urgently needed a morally clean president, a leader whose integrity was above any suspicion or stain associated with such repugnant scandals, solidifying the perception that this was not just a political dispute, but a battle for the very soul of leadership and public morality in a divided nation searching for a clear direction amid the chaos and uncertainty that seemed to dominate the scene. Thus, what began as an exchange of digital accusations quickly transformed into a fierce and relentless dispute, acquiring increasingly public and, in essence, violent contours, not in the direct physical sense, but in the virulence of the words, the aggressiveness of the communication strategies, and the intensity with which both sides sought to discredit and annihilate the reputation of the adversary in the public square, using digital platforms as battlefields where narratives clashed with full force, where each post, Each tweet, each statement was ammunition fired, with the aim of inflicting the maximum possible damage on the opponent and strengthening their own position before a global audience that watched everything with a mixture of perplexity and fascination. Witnessing two of the richest and most influential men on the planet engaged in a combat that seemed to surpass the limits of political sanity and enter the realm of personal drama taken to the extreme of public spectacle, making it impossible to ignore the dimension and scope of this confrontation that captured the attention of millions around the world, generating heated debates in every corner of the planet. With the escalation of tension reaching new peaks with each passing hour, the logistical and strategic response of both contenders was not long in coming, and they promptly mobilized their vast and formidable armies of lawyers, PR teams, media machines, and legions of loyal supporters who inhabit the digital trenches, each playing their part in this modern theater of war with surgical precision. The lawyers combing through documents and preparing legal defenses and offensives that promised complex clashes in court. The media and PR teams working tirelessly to control the narrative, launch informational counterattacks, and shape public perception in their favor. And the supporters, that fervent and engaged base that amplifies every message and attacks every criticism, serving as the digital infantry that propagates the versions of the facts that are convenient to them and bombards the credibility of the opponent with an intensity that reflects the unwavering loyalty to their respective icons, transforming this personal dispute into a mass phenomenon that engaged millions in a polarized discussion about power, secrecy, and the true nature of the global elites, demonstrating the complexity and scope of the forces that are activated when giants collide in public and private arenas. The law firms on both sides, comprised of some of the most expensive and renowned professionals in the legal world, began working at a frenetic pace, delving into the legal mazes and intricate details of past and present cases, preparing arguments that could both defend their clients against the most serious accusations and attack the credibility and allegations of the adversary with calculated aggression, searching for legal loopholes, exploiting technicalities, and formulating strategies that could turn the tide in their favor in the courts of public opinion and potentially in real courtrooms, should the legal dispute materialize in concrete lawsuits, raising the cost and complexity of this confrontation to levels that only astronomical fortunes could sustain, illustrating the enormous power that wealth confers in the ability to fight battles on multiple fronts simultaneously, from the legal domain to the information war that unfolded incessantly on global communication platforms. Meanwhile, the battle for the narrative intensified in traditional media and social networks, with each side using its vast influence and resources to disseminate its version of the facts, discredit the opponent, and garner public support, transforming the dispute into an unprecedented media spectacle, where shocking headlines and explosive tweets were launched at every moment, fueling the frenzy and keeping the global public captivated by this clash of titans that seemed to personify the excesses and tensions of the digital age and modern politics, culminating in a situation where polarization reached stratospheric levels and the search for genuine truth became increasingly blurred amid the overwhelming volume of information and misinformation that circulated freely, leaving the public perplexed and divided about who to believe and which side really represented the truth amid this whirlwind of accusations and counter-accusations that defined the essence of this epic clash. Global attention, which was already fixed on this battle of titans, intensified even more when newspapers around the world, with the diligence and fellatio that characterized the search for major scandals and dark secrets, began reporting in increasing detail on the contents of the Epstein files that were being in some way released or leaked in parts, confirming what Musk had suggested. the names of both Donald Trump and Elon Musk did indeed appear in different instances within that vast and disturbing trove of documents that chronicled years of interactions and associations with prominent figures in a variety of fields, from finance and politics to entertainment and science, casting a pall of suspicion and discomfort over the connections that the global elite had with the late financier and predator. And the mere mention of their names there, regardless of the exact context or the gravity of the association, was enough to generate shockwaves and feed the narrative that no one whose name was linked to Epstein could consider themselves entirely unscathed or morally untouched, making the situation unsustainable for both billionaires who, paradoxically, found themselves trapped in a web that neither of them wanted to be a part of, and from which both wanted to free themselves at any cost, as the simple association was already an indelible stain on their carefully constructed reputations. Given this public confirmation of their connections, however tenuous some tried to argue they were, the top priority for both billionaires became clear and urgent. Neither of them wanted, under any circumstances, to be the name most associated with this heinous and morally devastating scandal, because being at the top of the list of connections with Epstein would mean irreparable damage to their image, credibility, and, in the case of Trump, to his political aspirations, and in the case of Musk, to his reputation as a visionary innovator and public figure who seeks to shape the future, making it imperative for each of them to do everything possible to push the other into the center of the media and judicial hurricane, distancing themselves as much as possible from the zone of moral contamination that the files represented, intensifying the war of narratives that was already underway, but now with an even sharper focus on minimizing their own involvement and maximizing the opponent's connections to the darkest and most repugnant parts of the documents, transforming the dispute into a desperate race to avoid being the main scapegoat in a saga that disgusted the whole world. With the risk of having their most prominent names on Epstein's list becoming a real possibility, the war of narratives that initially seemed confined to the domain of public opinion and social networks quickly evolved and transmuted into a high-voltage political war, especially since one of the parties involved was a former president with ambitions of returning to power, and the other, a figure who, although not political in the traditional sense, exercised an enormous influence over the public sphere and possessed financial resources and communication platforms that could rival entire nations, making the confrontation not just a battle for reputation, but a direct clash that impacted the political scenario of one of the world's greatest powers, where past connections, kept secrets, and the ability to manipulate information became tools of power used with brutal and relentless precision, demonstrating how the boundaries between the personal, the business, and the political become incredibly fluid and dangerous at the top of the social and economic pyramid, where the secrets of a few can destabilize the plans of many, and where the truth is often the first victim in the search for relentless pursuit of control and influence in a world that is increasingly interconnected and transparent, but also increasingly susceptible to large-scale manipulation. On this chessboard of power and secrets, with the pressure increasing exponentially with each new revelation and each new headline, Donald Trump's strategy became increasingly evident and focused on one main objective: to silence Elon Musk, realizing that the statements and, more dangerously, the potential revelations that the technology billionaire could make represented a direct and existential threat to his campaign and his political future, making it imperative to silence this dissenting and powerful voice that had both the platform and the will to publicly confront him with potentially incriminating information or, at the very least, highly damaging to his image already weakened by so many other scandals and controversies, mobilizing all available resources from behind-the-scenes pressure to veiled or explicit threats through his spokespeople and allies in the media and politics in a desperate attempt to stem the reputational bleeding and neutralize the threat that Musk posed to his plans to return to power. In turn, Elon Musk, known for his resistance to giving in to pressure and for his tendency to use his vast digital platforms to retaliate and control the narrative, was not intimidated by Trump's attempts to silence him and responded in kind, raising the level of threat and confrontation by suggesting and even explicitly threatening the possibility of releasing a dossier, an organized collection of information and documents that could detail and prove Trump's connections to figures and events associated with Epstein and, potentially, other questionable activities, transforming the war of words into a war of information, where each side had the potential to inflict catastrophic damage on the other, with the constant threat that even deeper and more disturbing secrets could come to light at any moment, keeping the public and those involved in a constant state of alert, not knowing what the next bombshell would be and what devastating impact it would have on the global political and social scene, illustrating the fragility of reputations built on foundations of secrecy and the capacity that information-hidden powers have to redefine the power game at levels that few imagined possible in a world that intended to be increasingly transparent and fair in its judgments. But then, in the midst of this perfect storm of accusations, counter-accusations, threats, and partial revelations that kept the world in suspense, something completely unexpected happened. Something that was not in the script of any of the protagonists and that diverted attention in a drastic and surprising way, injecting a new and unpredictable element into a narrative that seemed confined to the dispute between two Western billionaires and the dark secrets of the American elite. Because a new name, until then peripheral or even unknown to the vast majority of the international public that followed the unfolding of the Epstein files with a mixture of horror and curiosity, began to be revealed in the documents that continued to gradually emerge from secrecy. A name that was not directly involved in the crimes or in the central activities of Epstein's network, but that appeared as a mention, a note in records of meetings or conversations, in contexts that spoke of African resistance and ideological threats to the global elite, two phrases that, in themselves, already carried a weight and an implication totally different from the sexual and financial scandal that initially dominated the narrative, suggesting that the Epstein files were not just a record of criminal and social activity, but also a snapshot of the concerns and fears circulating among certain spheres of the global elite regarding emerging forces and dissonant ideologies that might pose a challenge to the status quo they were working so hard to maintain and perpetuate, adding a layer of complexity and an unexpected geopolitical dimension to a scandal that had, until then, seemed confined to a relatively small and specific circle of power and privilege in the West. This name that emerged from the shadows of the Epstein files, diverting the focus from the Trump-Musk dispute and introducing a new and intriguing piece into this complex puzzle of power and influence, was IBRAHIM TRAORÉ, a figure who, although perhaps not universally known at the time to the Western public that consumed headlines about billionaires, already had a history and context that made him, in the eyes of certain global elites, a notable presence and, for some, even a potential threat. And the mention of his name in the Epstein files, even if tangentially, was not an isolated coincidence, but a reflection of the concerns that circulated in certain circles about figures and movements that questioned and challenged the established order. especially in regions of the world where Western influence faced new forms of resistance and search for autonomy. The emergence of this African name became a turning point in the narrative that until then seemed dominated by the intrigues and secrets of Western billionaires, because suddenly, global attention was forced to look beyond the Atlantic and consider how global power dynamics were challenging, interconnected in ways few had previously realized, revealing that Epstein's files were perhaps a broader mirror of the concerns of the global elite, including their fears about the emergence of new leadership in parts of the world traditionally seen as areas of influence to be controlled and exploited. This perception of Traoré as a figure worthy of attention, even if it was an attention fraught with apprehension and concern on the part of certain elites, was not something new or sudden in the context of the years prior to the revelation of the Epstein files, and dated back to an earlier period in 2018, when he was still relatively young and was just beginning to consolidate his position and influence in his country, Burkina Faso. But even at that early stage of his career, his way of thinking, his rhetoric, and his actions already made him stand out in a scenario where many leaders were perceived as more aligned or susceptible to the pressures and interests of foreign powers. And this independent stance and his growing popularity among youth and popular movements already made him considered by some analysts and attentive observers of geopolitical movements, especially those with closer ties to global power centers, as a rising anomaly, a figure who did not fit into the traditional mold and who had the potential to disrupt regional and, by extension, global power dynamics, attracting the attention, and not in a positive way, of those who had an interest in maintaining the status quo and predictability in international relations and in the exploitation of the natural and human resources of the African continent, anticipating, in a certain way, the role that it would later play on the global stage. The concern about the figure of Ibrahim Traoré among certain circles of the global elite is explicitly captured in a note revealed in Epstein's files, which transcripts or references a conversation that took place during a secret dinner, one of those discreet and exclusive meetings where real concerns and plans are often discussed away from the public eye and the press. In this case, a dinner with a prominent British banker, suggesting the type of circle in which Epstein moved and the subjects that were on the agenda of his conversations. And the mention of Traoré came in the form of a direct and incisive statement attributed to Epstein. This Burkina Bay boy could be the collapse of our mental empire in Africa, a short sentence, but loaded with meaning and revealing of the perspective that this elite had on Africa and on figures like Traoré, seeing the continent not as a collection of sovereign nations with the right to determine their own destinies, but as a mental empire to be controlled, a space where ideas and narratives could be shaped and influenced from the outside, and the rise of a leader who questioned this influence and promoted autonomy and self-determination was therefore seen as a direct threat to this structural and teleological control that for them sustained many other forms of domination, from economic to political, revealing the depth of apprehension that figures like Traoré inspired in those who benefited from the global status quo. The revelation of this detail, this seemingly small mention in Epstein's vast and disturbing files that carried immense symbolic and geopolitical weight, turned everything in the narrative that dominated the headlines upside down, diverting the focus from the billionaire's feud and introducing a new and powerful layer of meaning to the scandal. Because suddenly, the Epstein case was not just about sex crimes and elite connections, but also about the secret concerns of the global elite, about the emerging resistance in other parts of the world, especially in Africa, and the figure of Ibrahim Traoré, the Burkina boy who could be the collapse of the mental empire, emerged from the shadows to center stage, not as someone implicated in the crimes, but as someone feared by the same people who were associated with the scandal, creating a stark contrast and a profound irony that captured the world's attention in an unexpected way. Because while Trump and Musk were publicly battling it out and drowning in their own controversies linked to their dark past, a figure from a relatively small African country emerged as a symbol of a larger, more fundamental challenge to the global order that Epstein's elite and their associates seem so desperate to maintain, redefining what the Epstein case really represented and who the real antagonists were in the eyes of those who saw themselves as guardians of a global empire that apparently included a mind empire to be defended against the rise of independent, visionary leaders who dared to think and act outside the molds established by outside powers. Thus, the entry of Ibrahim Traoré into this global narrative, albeit initially through an indirect and apprehensive mention in the Epstein files, had the immediate effect of recontextualizing the entire scandal and the dispute between the billionaires, showing that the elite's concerns went far beyond financial and sexual intrigues, also encompassing the maintenance of a certain kind of ideological and political control in crucial regions of the globe, and the mere mention of his name as a potential threat revealed more about the mindset and fears of these elites than many volumes of analysis could, for Traoré represented the kind of leader they feared: young, charismatic, popular, and crucially, with a vision for his country and his continent that prioritized sovereignty and dignity over complacency and submission, making him, in their view, a dangerous disruptor to the order that served their interests. And the fact that his name appeared in the Epstein files, an epicenter of global secrecy and influence, underscored the seriousness with which this anomaly in the rise of the Epstein was seen by the guardians of the status quo, even if his involvement was only as a figure to be watched and, presumably, contained or neutralized in some way, adding a layer of suspense and a geopolitical dimension to a story that was already complex, but which now took on the air of a battle for narratives and sovereignty on a truly global scale, connecting the secrets of Western billionaires to the challenges faced by African nations in their search for a more just and autonomous future, demonstrating how the Epstein scandal touched sensitive nerves that reverberated across the planet, exposing the hidden concerns of those who wield great power and influence on the world stage and fear the rise of forces that might challenge their dominance. In a moment that would become iconic and would be etched into the memory of many around the world as an unexpected turning point in the geopolitical landscape, and in the way African leadership is perceived globally, Ibrahim Traoré, the Burkinabe leader, whose name emerged from the Epstein files as a figure feared by the elite for his potential to collapse the empire of the mind in Africa, delivered a historic speech before international cameras, in a scene that seemed to have come straight out of a movie script, capturing the attention of millions who until then had been immersed in the squabble of Western billionaires, but who now turned to hear the voice of a young leader from an African country, a voice that brought with it a radically different perspective and a direct challenge to the dominant narrative that attempted to frame him as a threat to an empire of the mind that many did not even know existed, demonstrating the ability of certain leaders to transcend geographic and political limitations to speak to a global audience on issues that resonate universally, such as sovereignty, dignity, and the fight for a future where humanity and the earth are valued above profit and control. The essence of this speech, which echoed across continents, breaking down the cultural and ideological barriers that often divide the world, lay in a powerful contrast and implicit critique of the way the global elite, and specifically the Western billionaires involved in the Epstein scandal, viewed power and the future. As Trump and Musk engaged in a bitter war over dark secrets and the presidency of a nation, TRAORÉ presented an alternative and inspiring vision, expressed in a phrase that would immediately become viral and emblematic. While you fight over who will be king of the ruins, we are building real kingdoms. A statement that not only contrasted the destructive and self-destructive nature of Western competition with the constructive and forward-looking ambition of the movement he represented, but also redefined what it means to build a kingdom, suggesting that true construction and true power lie not in the accumulation of wealth or the conquest of traditional political office, but in the construction of just, sovereign, and resilient societies, where the needs and dignity of the people are met, of the people and the preservation of the land are absolute priorities, challenging the notion that the only relevant form of power is that exercised from traditional centers of global influence. Expanding on the idea of real kingdoms being built, TRAORÉ delved into details that underscored the fundamental difference in perspective between his vision and that of those involved in the Epstein scandal and the billion-dollar dispute, focusing on aspects that touched on open wounds of history and the present, such as exploitation and vulnerability, declaring that in his kingdoms under construction, children do not disappear. A clear and painful reference to the most macabre and repulsive aspect of the Epstein case and global concerns about trafficking and exploitation. And that land is not a commodity, it is an inheritance, a powerful statement that directly confronts the extractive and mercantilist logic that has dominated Western-African relations for centuries, where the continent's vast natural resources are often seen as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited for the benefit of external interests, rather than as the foundation of the lives and future of future generations of Africans. Properties to be cared for and protected with reverence and responsibility, thus presenting a vision of development and sovereignty that is grounded in human dignity and in respect for nature, in stark contrast to the worldview exposed in the Epstein files, which seem to reduce everything and everyone, including human beings and natural resources, to objects of transaction, control, and exploitation in a cynical game of power and satisfaction of perverse appetites. The impact of TRAORÉ's speech was immediate and resounding, going viral at an astonishing speed through the same social networks that Trump and Musk used to wage their private war, but in a completely different way. Because while the billionaire's messages fueled controversy and polarization, TRAORÉ's words resonated with an authenticity and depth that transcended political and cultural barriers, touching on universal themes of justice, dignity, and resistance to oppression. And the fact that he did not make direct accusations or enter the billionaire's personal fight, but rather presented an alternative perspective that exposed the futility and hypocrisy of their confrontation in light of much more significant existential challenges, was the genius of his approach. Because he did not stoop to the level of petty squabbling, he disarmed it, dismantled it, showing that while some were concerned with being kings of ruins forged in dark secrets and ego battles, others were focused on the monumental and worthy task of building a future based on fundamental values, using the opportunity that the Epstein scandal created to refocus the global discussion on issues that really matter, seizing the moment of exposure to present a vision that was at once a scathing critique of the status quo and an inspiring call for a different future, demonstrating that true power can come not from wealth or control, but from moral clarity and a vision for a better future. Faced with the strength and moral clarity of Traoré's speech, which resonated with millions of people around the world who were fed up with the intrigues and hypocrisy of the global elite, the response from Donald Trump and Elon Musk was, remarkably, silence. A deafening silence that contrasted dramatically with the verbosity and aggressiveness that had characterized their dispute up until that point. And this lack of response, this inability to respond or counter-argue, spoke louder than any statement, because they, the titans of wealth and influence in the West, were suddenly silenced by a leader of an African country who, using truth and a worldview based on fundamental human values, managed to expose the superficiality and fragility of their own battle, demonstrating that, however powerful they were in their own domains, they did not have a monopoly on the narrative or moral legitimacy on the global stage, and at this crucial moment, they were, in fact, swallowed up by the very past they had tried so hard to hide or manipulate, with the secrets of Epstein hanging over them like a dark cloud, preventing them from responding to a critique that, while not personally accusatory, laid bare the insignificance of their dispute in light of larger struggles for sovereignty and human dignity elsewhere in the world. For the first time in a long time, perhaps at an unprecedented point in the digital age when attention is a scarce commodity and the dominant narrative is often shaped by the traditional power centers of the West, the Internet, that vast and often chaotic network of information and opinion, stopped, or at least significantly slowed its incessant march of ephemeral content, to genuinely listen to an African president, not because he was involved in a Western elite scandal, but because he offered a perspective and insight that was both refreshing and deeply relevant to the challenges facing the world, providing an essential counterpoint to the narrative centered on billionaires feuding and the dark secrets of the Western elite, demonstrating that wisdom, leadership, and the vision of a better future are not exclusive to any region or social group, and that voices from places often marginalized in the global discourse have the capacity to capture the world's attention and redefine public debate, while the other two, Trump and Musk, the figures who had dominated the headlines for weeks with their self-destructive feud and their shadowy connections with the Epstein case, they were suddenly relegated to the background, swallowed up by the very storm they helped create, with their credibility and relevance to the discussion about the global future diminishing as the clear and firm voice of IBRAHIM Traoré resonated with a truth that money and traditional power seemed incapable of silencing or refuting, marking a significant moment in the evolution of the global narrative and the perception of leadership coming from the global South. Amid the complex and disturbing web of documents emerging from Jeffrey Epstein's files, painting a dark portrait of the connections and concerns of a certain global elite, one of the final documents to emerge added a particularly revealing and shocking layer to the story, offering a glimpse into the plans and mindset of those who believe they held the reins of world power behind the scenes, as this document detailed what appeared to be an audacious and sinister plan to create a new, secret global control club, an inner circle even more exclusive and powerful than any other elite group in existence, with the explicit goal of consolidating and exercising control over the course of the planet by deliberately and actively excluding leaders and prominent figures who were perceived as not bending to their interests, worldview, or influence, revealing the depth of the paranoia and scope of the ambitions for total control that circulated among Epstein and his associates, who were not content with the power and influence they already had, but actively sought to forge a future where any form of resistance or independence was systematically eradicated in favor of centralized and unchallenged rule, demonstrating the lengths to which certain minds at the top of the global pyramid were willing to maintain and expand their empire of influence and control. The revelation of this plan for a secret global control club was disturbing in itself, painting a picture of a disconnected and arrogant elite that saw itself as the only ones capable of guiding the destiny of the world, and that feared any form of autonomy or challenge to its self-proclaimed authority. But the document contained a detail that made it even more significant, and that connected it directly to the narrative that was emerging from the mentions found earlier in the files. Because in this plan of exclusion and control, which listed or described the types of leaders to be kept on the sidelines or actively neutralized for not bending, the name of Ibrahim Traoré, the same Burkinabe leader who had been mentioned earlier at a secret dinner as a threat to the mental empire in Africa, appeared in this context of figures to be excluded from the new global control club, confirming that he was seen by these architects of hidden power as a prime example of the type of leader who represented an existential threat to their vision of a world totally under their control, solidifying the perception that Traoré was not just an anomaly to be watched, but a force to be actively excluded from any global power structure they sought to create or influence, demonstrating the level of concern he inspired among those who saw themselves as the true rulers of the world, even if behind the scenes. The most striking and symbolically powerful detail associated with Traoré's name in this document of the plan for the secret club of global control was the fact that his name appeared crossed out, a simple but meaningful mark that suggested that he had been considered for inclusion, or at least for management within the logic of the club, but that this possibility had been discarded for some crucial reason, and next to the crossed-out name, a handwritten or typed note in a tone almost of resignation or recognition of a force that could not be manipulated or contained by the traditional methods employed by this elite, who used money, influence, and presumably the secrets contained in the archives as tools of control. And this note, these two concise words that sealed Traoré's perception in the eyes of these architects of global control, were incorruptible, dangerous, revealing the real reason why he could not be part of their plans or be bent to their will. Because he possessed an integrity that made him immune to the temptations and pressures that worked with others. And this incorruptibility, combined with his growing influence and his vision of autonomy and sovereignty, made him, in the twisted logic of this elite, dangerous to their interests and to the mental empire that they sought to preserve at all costs, because he represented a model of leadership that challenged the very foundation on which their power rested. The phrase, incorruptible, dangerous, found next to Ibrahim Traoré's crossed-out name in documents outlining the elite's plans for a secret global control club, quickly transcended its original context in the Epstein files to become a powerful and resonant symbol of global resistance, especially in parts of the world that have long sought to free themselves from the shackles of outside influence and exploitation. For these two words encapsulated the essence of the threat that authentic leaders committed to the good of their people posed to those whose power depended on their ability to corrupt, manipulate, and control, and the fact that the same elite associated with a scandal of global proportions and hidden control plans viewed incorruptibility as something to be feared and labeled as dangerous revealed more about the nature of this elite than anything else, underscoring the disconnect between its values and the values that many around the world aspire to in their leaders, turning the note by Epstein and his associates into a kind of unwitting endorsement of the integrity of Traoré and the legitimacy of his fight for sovereignty and dignity, making the phrase incorruptible dangerous, a rallying cry and a reminder that the real threat to the rule of the global elite does not come from other billionaires or military powers, but from leaders and movements who refuse to give in to corruption and who dare to build kingdoms based on values that are not negotiable for money or power, inspiring a new generation to believe that resistance is possible and that integrity is, in fact, a force to be feared by those who build empires on foundations of secrecy and manipulation. The climax of this saga, which began with a dispute between billionaires and turned into a revelation about the secret concerns of the global elite and the rise of an African leader, reached its climax with the discovery of the final document, the one that not only exposed the plan for a secret global control club and the intention to exclude leaders who would not bend, but which, crucially, revealed the final and most telling assessment of Ibrahim Traoré by that elite, the notation incorruptible, dangerous, an acknowledgement that he was immune to the tools of control that worked on others, and that his integrity made him an existential threat to their vision of a world under their rule. And this final revelation, this confirmation that Traoré's incorruptibility was seen as a maximum danger by the same elite implicated in the darkest secrets of the Epstein case, brought the narrative full circle in a striking way, contrasting the moral decay and thirst for control of an elite with the rise of a leader whose strength lay precisely in his integrity and in his refusal to bow to external pressures, solidifying his status not only as a relevant political figure, but as a symbol of resistance and hope for many who seek a future free from the domination and exploitation that the Epstein files exposed in its most raw and disgusting form, demonstrating that the real battle for the future is not fought in the corridors of traditional power or in the headlines of billionaire scandals, but in the ability to maintain integrity and dare to be incorruptible in a world that too often rewards complacency and corruption. And so the story unfolds, revealing deeper layers about who really holds power and who challenges it, showing that the world behind the scenes is more complex and interconnected than it seems, where the intrigues of the Western elite can unexpectedly intersect with the struggles for sovereignty in the global South, and where truth and integrity, even when labeled as dangerous by those who fear losing control, have an intrinsic force capable of turning the tables and redefining the game of power. And if this narrative resonated with you, if it opened your eyes to new perspectives on the behind the scenes of the world, on the nature of power, and on the unexpected strength that emerges from resistance based on integrity, show your support so that this message and other in-depth analyses reach an even wider audience, and so that we can continue to unravel together the complexities of our time. A simple and powerful act that strengthens the space for information and informed debate, contributing to the construction of a community that seeks to understand the forces that shape our present and our future. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that challenge the dominant narrative and reveal the hidden truths that impact our lives, ensuring that you are always informed and prepared to understand the tectonic movements that occur on the global stage, becoming part of an engaged community that values depth and relevance in the analysis of world events that are often presented in a superficial or distorted way by the mainstream media. And your subscription is a fundamental step in ensuring that important voices and perspectives, which are often marginalized, find space to resonate and inspire. Like this video if you felt the strength and importance of this narrative, if it provoked reflection, and if you believe that stories like this deserve to be told and wildly disseminated, because each like is an indicator of relevance that helps algorithms understand that this content is valuable and should be shared with more people around the world, expanding the reach of this message that integrity and resistance can, in fact, be powerful forces for change in a world where power and corruption often go hand in hand. and your simple click has a real impact on the visibility and dissemination of crucial information. And crucially, please share your thoughts, reflections, and questions in the comments below, because building understanding and deepening analysis happens through dialogue and the exchange of ideas, and your unique perspective enriches the discussion and helps us all see different angles of this complex tapestry of power, secrets, and resistance that is being woven before our eyes, making this space a vibrant and intelligent forum to explore the implications of these events and what they mean for the future of our countries and the world, transforming the act of commenting into an active participation in the construction of collective knowledge that is fundamental to navigating the challenges of the 21st century.